I'm Professor Cathy Willis, and I'm here to welcome you to this extinction debate. I am a Professor of Biodiversity in the Department of Zoology and a Principal of St Edmund Hall, but I was formerly a tutor in geography and worked for 10 years, I think, with Patricia at Jesus College. So it's very, very nice to virtually come back to Jesus College. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen with a few opening slides and to give a background to the overall debate and the themes behind it. If you have just joined now, please could you make sure you turn off your microphones and your cameras, unless you're one of the panelists. That's the first thing. And secondly, if you have questions that you'd like to see debated, please make use of the chat box at the bottom of the screen and put your question in there. Right, so I'm now going to try and share my screen just to start the debate going. So where are we? Here we go. Share. So can everybody see my screen? Please nod if you can. So I understand this is part of a series that Jesus College are having on what really matters, and this is number 5 in this debate series. Sounds like a very good series to me, very good idea. But the extinction crisis is a particularly topical one, and I don't think anybody who, or I hope nobody who's on this screen or listening in today hasn't been affected by some of the media discussions about the current extinction crisis in the last couple of weeks or last couple of months. Oh, now I can't get this to move. So one of the first things that came out that really drew everyone's attention to the extinction crisis was this large global report that came out late last year, and it was a global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And this report, which had 189 countries contributed to this report and 500 scientists working on it, they assessed over 15,000 published papers which looked at trends in species, in populations and communities across the world from 1970 to present. And what they found from this is that of all the groups they looked at, there were dramatic declines occurring. And they concluded from this report, one of the main themes that got picked up by the media very much so, was that the number of species currently threatened with extinction is unprecedented in human history, and that an estimated 1 million species of animals and plants are predicted to go extinct, some of them even as rapidly as in the next decade. So following on from that, earlier this year, there was the Living Planet report, which was released from WWF and other partners. This is another one where they looked at from 1970 to 2017. They stated there was an average of 68% decline in the Living Planet Index, which looks at trends in what's happening with populations. And then only this week, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew released a report on the state of the world's plants and fungi, and concluded in this, and one of the headlines that came through was up to 40% of the world's plants are threatened with extinction. So I think most people agree broadly on the causes of these extinctions, and this is a paper that was published earlier this year in Science, that you've got these indirect drivers such as demographic and social cultural factors, economic, technological, etc. But actually the direct drivers, and one of the most direct drivers in accounting for most of the extinctions right now, is land use change, and land use change driven by requirements for resources for humans, but many different things in there. Direct overexploitation of plants and animals, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species, and a few other things. Sorry, I'll go back. So the questions really that come through from this, and you hear people saying these time and again, and these are questions, in fact, that the panel sent me when I said, well, what are the provocative questions we should be debating? And the first one is, we keep saying about the numbers of plants and animals going extinct, but does this really matter? Who's the crisis? Is it a crisis? And who's it a crisis for? Whose conservation are we talking about? Is this a Western construct about extinction and the worries about it, or is it a global issue that we should all be concerned about? What about the cost of biodiversity? Is this a luxury that we can no longer afford? And which approaches are going to turn the tide on extinction? For many, many years, we've often seen the fluffy pandas of WWF and the iconic picture of the polar bear on the melting ice cap. but is that having the impact? Or is it really these direct actions of people like Extinction Rebellion that is going to make the difference? So we've got 4 excellent panelists to talk about this today. First of all, we've got Tanisha Allen, who is a researcher at WildCrew, which is the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit. She's waving on the screen. We've got Tim Coulson, who's the Professor of Zoology and Head of Department in Zoology. We've got Richard Grenier, who's an Associate Professor of Physical Geography, and Erin Salt, who's an Associate Professor of Paleobiology in the Department of Earth Sciences. So the structure then of the debate for the rest of the time now is, first of all, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves on the screen to all of us. And then we'll start with some of those questions that we had at I've just put up in the panelists suggested, just to get the debate going. But please, a debate is only as good as the audience questions. So please do put those questions into the chat box and we will certainly debate them. And then at the very end, we will summarize. I don't think we're aiming to come to any conclusions, but certainly summarize the discussion and hopefully leave everyone going away thinking a bit further about this extinction crisis. So without further ado, I'd like to now hand over. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand over to the panelists. So let's go with Tanisha first. Oh, you need to unmute, Tanisha.
There we go. So hi everyone, I'm Tanisha. As you can tell by my accent, I'm unfortunately American. And I am a final year DPhil student in the Department of Zoology. I'm doing my Viva in 2 weeks, so wish me luck. And during my time here, I studied olfactory communication in the European badger population in Wytham Woods. And before that, I did my master's in zoology at Cambridge. And I studied animal sciences at Washington State University, which is about 5 hours east of Seattle.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's move on to Richard next.
Hi, my name is Richard Grenier. I'm Associate Professor of Biodiversity, Biogeography and Conservation at the School of Geography. I am Kathy's successor as physical geography tutor at Jesus. I work on a variety of conservation-related problems, mostly revolving around how to use more data more sensibly and faster to provide decision support for conservation planning, policy, and arguments.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Tim.
So as Kathy said, I'm head of department, or one of the 2 heads of department of zoology. My research interests are really trying to link together theory in ecological dynamics, so why we see changes in numbers of animals and plants over time, with evolutionary dynamics, so why do we see changes in behaviors and morphology and things like that. And then I try and test that theory and predictions that theory makes with a wide range of systems, both from the lab through to experimental systems in the field, through to observational systems. And the 2 systems I spend most of my time working on are freshwater streams in Trinidad, where we see quite rapid evolutionary change. And I work on the ecosystem in Yellowstone National Park, where we have been examining over many years the consequences of, first of all, wolf extinction in Yellowstone, and then a reintroduction that started in 1995.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, Erin.
Yeah, so I'm Erin Saup. Unfortunately, I'm also American. I'm an associate professor of paleobiology in the Department of Earth Sciences and a tutorial fellow at St. Hugh's College. I am a paleontologist, so I study past life and past extinction events. I'm interested in understanding factors that promote speciation, so creation of new species, but also the factors that promote extinction. Then using the fossil record, determining how species have responded to past environmental changes and how we can potentially use that knowledge to inform conservation of species today. And this is a newly emerging field called conservation paleobiology, which asks whether we can use the past and the record contained in the fossil record to help us conserve biodiversity today.
Fantastic. So as you will see, we've got a very diverse and appropriate panel here. So I hope we're going to have some good discussion amongst everyone. Okay, let's start then with that first question. The most basic one here, I think, is, does it matter if species go extinct? So which of the panelists would like to start on this one? Maybe Erin, since you're coming with the fossil record approach.
Sure, yeah. So with regard to this question, does it matter if species go extinct because species have gone extinct throughout Earth history? And I would say, yes, species have gone extinct throughout Earth history. And in fact, around 99% of all species that have ever existed on Earth are now extinct. Extinction is a natural process, and we can actually quantify the rate of extinction, which we call background extinction, using the fossil record. And we think that rate of background extinction is about 1 to 5 species per year based on fossil record data. But what we also know from the fossil record is that there have been periods in Earth history when there have been mass extinction events. So when large numbers of species go extinct in a relatively rapid period or short period of time. And we think that there have been around 5 of those mass extinction events in Earth history. Actually, recent research this year suggests maybe there's only 4 of those in Earth history. But regardless of how many there are, these episodes of mass extinction have wiped out huge numbers of species, so up to 90% of species on Earth. And they dramatically affected ecosystems and food webs. And so I would argue that it matters if species go extinct in large enough numbers because we may approach some threshold that will destabilize ecosystems and food webs and push us into a 6th or 5th, depending on your definition, mass extinction event. And it matters to us as humans because most of us would not survive such an event. In the case of mass extinctions, basically we're doomed because there's these catastrophic failures of food webs and ecosystems. For example, the largest mass extinction event in Earth history was the end Permian mass extinction event. This happened about 251 million years ago. And in this event, 95% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial species went extinct. And it took about 4 million years for there to have been an increase in speciation rates to actually replenish those species. So these are massive events. So I think, yeah, extinction matters today because we saw from the papers that Kathy told us about that the rate of extinction is accelerating. And we don't want to reach a threshold that will start to destabilize food webs, ecological networks, and push us into a mass extinction event, because that would mean pretty bad consequences for humanity. And then more esoterically, I think I would also argue that we should care about extinctions because the presence of species increases our quality of life and brings joy and beauty to the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's say, Tim, what's your thoughts on this one?
Thanks. So I think it depends on the timescale that you're looking at, because as Erin says, extinction is the inevitable fate of all species. Some hang around longer for others. And I suspect should we care really boils down to, do we care about our future as humanity? So what we're really asking is, do we care if we drive our own species towards extinction? And we do have the capacity to do that. We don't have the capacity to wipe out all life on Earth, I don't think, but we do have the capacity to wipe ourselves out. And we have the capacity to do that through changing the environment. So not just through sort of, nuclear war or what have you, but we could push, as Erin was pointing out, we could push the Earth's system, the climate and the feedback loops that have traditionally kept the climate within bounds, and those feedback loops are generated by the biosphere, so by biodiversity. We do have the potential to make Earth such an unpleasant place for us, we drive ourselves extinct. And the way that would potentially pan out is after previous changes in climate or past extinctions, the world recovers, and it recovers because of the biosphere. But if we raise carbon dioxide levels as we're doing, as we simultaneously destroy or massively impact the biosphere and biodiversity, we're losing that buffer that we have that provides us with a level of protection. And so you might say, yeah, but humans are going to go extinct one day because you just said all species are going extinct. And this is where time frame matters. And we are changing things very, very quickly. And we don't know what the end point of that is going to be. But the end point of that could be a situation that isn't great for civilization. And I think that's probably what I'm concerned about, because I suspect within the next 50 to 100 years, unless we change our actions, we are going to be living in a very different world. And I'm not persuaded it's going to be a great world for humanity.
Okay, so can you be more upbeat?
Do I care about whether individual species go extinct? Mostly no. There are one or two species that are what people used to call keystone species, that if you lose them from ecosystems, the whole functioning of the ecosystem will change. So we see that on Yellowstone, where wolves were driven locally extinct. We saw a fairly rapid increase in their prey called elk, which are a bit like our red deer. And that's led to changes in the degree of the type of vegetation you get. So we've kind of gone from more of a forested ecosystem on the northern range to more of an open one. We've brought the wolves back. Is the system going to go back to the way it was? Maybe eventually, but it's going to take a very, very long time. Things don't bounce back quickly. So in that case, the wolf is a kind of major driver of the dynamics of that system. If you lose carnivores, that's when you really, or the key drivers that limit the dynamics of ecosystems. If you lose the keystone species, you can have big effects on the way nature looks. But the majority of species, if you drive them extinct, are going to have very little effect on the ecosystem. So you lose pandas, you know, who cares?
Okay, I'm going to hand over then to Tanisha to say, you lose pandas, who cares?
Let's see. So I guess my view is kind of in between Tim and Aaron's, is that yes, extinction is a natural process, and that this earth has existed before, you know, before we came along, and it will exist after us. Now, whether or not that, you know, this earth becomes inhospitable for life, like, you know, Venus or Mercury, because of what we're doing to the atmosphere with carbon dioxide levels, then, you know, yeah, that is a serious possibility. But yeah, it's like, I think that the extinction of humanity, like, I guess in our own self-preservation, you know, instinct, like, yes, that matters, especially if we plan on having some type of earth to pass down to our children or grandchildren. So I think it's funny when people have children or grandchildren and then they don't even think about the consequences of their own ecological actions, because again, you know, what type of environment are you leaving your children to live in afterwards? And then I do agree with Tim, like, that there are some species where if we lose them, it's not going to have as big of an effect on our ecosystem. I love pandas. I'm not going to say pandas don't matter, but and I love badgers. I'm not going to say badgers don't matter, but I do. But in terms of just the objective sense of which species will have the most impact on the ecosystem if they became extinct, then yes, that is a serious question. And then we obviously do need to prioritize the extinction of those keystone species, which I guess leads into another interesting question, which is, you know, which species do we care about? Because as you mentioned before, you know, a lot of plants and invertebrates are going extinct as well, and yet, you know, we rarely talk about those extinction events compared to the extinction of, you know, of more charismatic species like mammals, especially like large cats. So yes, like, in terms of humanity, yes, it matters that we are possibly leading to our own demise. But in terms of just the overall grand scheme of things, you know, life goes on. It may not be our life, but, you know, life goes on.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. Rich.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I'm not too sure about some of this direction actually. I absolutely agree that rate is important. The rate of extinction is the thing that matters for making sense of all of this. I'm quite dubious about drawing links between the idea of the death of individuals and the death of species. And although there's lots of science which actually draws on the same idea of vital rates of birth and death rates and so on to underpin biodiversity science, but conservation thinking, and especially thinking about extinction, it gets more problematic when you do that. But I think for the rates idea, especially given what's going on in the world at the moment, I think we've got a very sensible analogy there. So how seriously would we take somebody if they stood up and said, the thing about pandemics is like, well, everybody dies, don't they, really, at some point, and we just ought to accept that. And of course, the entire response is, well, yeah, no, but not at this kind of a rate. And I think that's actually a pretty good analogy. We could carry on with it a little bit and start asking, well, okay, well, what happens if we lose a large number of people from the world's population? And one of the things that's been said is, well, you know, some species have an ecological role that makes them particularly important, and we don't want those to go extinct. But there's some other species which, I'm not sure pandas are even one of those actually, but I don't know. There's some species which, you know, ecologically, not so much keystone as more sort of peripheral bit part extra species, and we can probably lose those without having big ecological function. Now, one thing that really struck me about COVID and the responses that we've had collectively has been, because COVID focuses its mortality particularly towards people who are older and not so much people who are younger, but that wasn't true of, say, the bird or swine flu epidemics, which threatened to do the same thing about 10 years ago. There, we would have been losing concomitant numbers of very young people. And at the time, some very strong arguments were made that would be an enormous loss of future leaders and potential. We can't obviously decide who those people who died, who would otherwise have made huge contributions were, but obviously if you lose a lot of younger people, you lose a lot of potential. And I think that follows through for our extinction thinking as well. Sure, there are species right now which are not contributing a great deal to the energy flows within the ecosystems that they live in, but we don't know how that changes on a 100,000 year time frame. We're getting better at doing that thanks to work people like Kathy. But we still don't actually know very much about what's going to happen in the next 1,000 years, and how, for example, the absence of pandas may well actually result in changes in the distribution of bamboo forests over the next 1,000 years. Now they're not able to do that at the moment, but if the limits to that might change, so even species that we lose today that don't seem to be doing anything, it's vastly possible because they haven't had the opportunity yet, and consequently losing species today is actually losing function and flexibility for not tomorrow, but maybe the day after.
Okay, thank you. Tim, you're shaking your head. Would you like to come back in?
I'm sorry, Rich, but I disagree with that argument. I think you go down a route there where you end up making arguments that you want to try and conserve particular alleles at individual genetic loci. And I think that one of the things that through the study of evolution over reasonably long timescales that we've learned is that actually you can get to the same endpoint from a number of different starting points. So, for example, you see the evolution of things like marsupial wolves and marsupial lions, and you see other groups of mammals going down that road. You see birds and some mammal species filling very similar ecological niches across different areas. So with great respect, I think we probably can lose a number of species without losing the potential for adaptation down the line.
Okay, all right. So I'm feeling rather sorry for the panda right now. Erin or Tanisha, do you want to come back in at this point? Either of you anyone want to protect the panda? Okay, let's move on then to the next question, which is moving actually more towards this question of a crisis for whom. We're all talking about an extinction crisis. We see it in the papers, the number of times it's come through in the media, but it's predominantly the Western media. And do we have a right, for example, to tell people that actually they shouldn't be eating pangolins or using pangolin scales for traditional medicines? So is this extinction, the whole concept of extinction, is this a concept that is very angled towards particular parts of society? So I'd like each of you to give me your thoughts on that and where you come on this. So let's start with Tanisha this time.
Okay, so this is a particular topic that I'm very interested in because I've become more interested in like a lot of equality, diversity, and inclusion work. And I do think that a lot of this conversation about extinction and conservation is very Western focused. For example, Indigenous people, they have been living on the earth, you know, or I'd rather say they lived with the earth for thousands of years before their lands were stolen and colonized. And with these Indigenous people, they manage to, you know, whenever they do, you know, hunt animals or use nature, they use every single part of it. And the ecosystem, you know, managed to survive and thrive when they were living on these lands. And then, of course, as soon as, you know, Western civilization came up, and especially with, you know, capitalism and everything else, you know, when we came to that point, then we started to extract too much from the earth and from the resources. So I believe that it is very Western focused, in that there is a lot to be learned from, you know, other cultures, especially Indigenous cultures, you know, or other cultures where people know how to live alongside the land in a way that, yes, you know, you can use it for your own well-being and survival, but you can also respect the earth and help it to thrive in a way that the earth will survive, not only for current and future humans, but also for current and future species. In terms of pangolins and traditional medicine, to be honest, I don't know much about that. Although I am very hesitant about speaking over other cultures in terms of, you know, telling them what traditions they have are right or wrong. I'm very hesitant about that because it seems to come across as very neo-colonialist and saying, oh, well, you don't, you know, oh, well, you need to do it the Western way. And so I'm very hesitant about speaking about that. But I think if you want to move this, you know, these conversations away from the Western focused approach, the best way to do that would be to get more conservationists, ecologists, and researchers from underrepresented and marginalized groups. And that way we can get different perspectives that will allow us to, you know, see this problem from different perspectives and also be able to address this problem from different perspectives rather than this Western, predominantly white, male approach.
Okay, all right, thank you. So Tim, let's have your response to that.
So I think it's everyone's crisis because it's, you know, talking about Earth systems and what have you. So I don't think it's just a localized crisis. I agree with Tanisha that in order to get global buy-in, you need to have people from multiple different cultures and multiple different backgrounds appreciating where we're at, what the risks are and ways out of that that risk. So we definitely need to work together, and we need to be culturally sensitive. One area is you know, in terms of in terms of the use of local medicines and local cures, my view is that I think education is key. If they work, fantastic. But what I'm concerned about is people, you know, I'm concerned about people using cures that aren't going to work for them for serious illness. And the reason I'm worried about that is because, you know, we can treat things like sepsis in young babies with antibiotics. And I would rather we did that and save those babies' lives rather than treating them with some local remedy that doesn't work. And so that's about lives. I'm not saying that people don't have the right to, you know, to think about their medicines they've used in the past and historically, but I'd like to see some education around that. And I want to do that because I think that has the potential to reduce suffering in many areas. But the way you do that, I think, is through culturally sensitive education around this topic. But we need to get on with that because that takes time, and time is ticking, and the crisis is going to get worse with each passing year unless we actually do something about it.
Yeah, thank you. Erin.
I think I would echo what Tim said with regard to this being a global crisis, and we need the buy-in from all different cultures and all different communities. And so, and in that sense, I agree with Tanisha as well. So I think we need to consider different perspectives about how to tackle this crisis, consider different groups' expertise. And I think we can't partition it to say, oh, well, this species is in this part of the world and this species is in this part of the world. And therefore, you know, we're not going to consider this whole ecosystem approach and Earth system approach. All of the Earth systems are interconnected in some form or fashion. And so I think we need to sort of approach this in a multifaceted way. And so that requires the buy-in of all different communities, individuals, groups, cultures, etc.
Okay, thank you. And Rich.
Yeah, thanks. So there's a few things going on here. I mean, the first one of which is to absolutely recognise that conservation as an industry has a massive diversity problem, a huge diversity problem. It's particularly evident in the UK, but it's evident worldwide, and that's part of a much more systemic problem, which is actually that most conservation is done at a distance. And that distance tends to be between, as we've noticed, Western societies and the places where the biodiversity is. There's an enormous amount of evidence that almost all on-the-ground conservation efforts work better, possibly even work at all, on the basis that they are projects which are done by people who are intimately connected to the land and biodiversity which is affected by whatever the problem is, and that's where solutions come from. That's not to say that frankly, big Western organizations or governments need to get out of it. What they need to do is to carry on providing money and support and providing more of both, but doing it in a way which does not come with the top-down management approach that has characterized the industry for the last 100 years or so. In short, you can take a very pragmatic view for this, which is that conservation works better when it's done by people. I don't like the phrase local people, but I think people who are intimately connected, and consequently that's what we need to do. So we could leave as much of the contemporary politics out of it as it's pragmatic to do if we wanted to. I personally don't think we should, but if we wanted to just look at it as a management problem, it's actually got a solution that's staring us in the face anyway, which is to do much less in the way of distance management. The final thing is that when it comes to traditional uses of plants and animals, it's certainly true that many formulations and many ways in which species are used are by far could be improved in terms of their efficacy. But it's a mistake to say that every use of biodiversity by somebody who's not using it as part of a Western medicine tradition is ineffective. There are particularly when it comes to plant usage, there are ways, almost always ways in which you can improve the delivery of whatever the pharmacologically active compounds are. But that's actually true of most drugs in the Western tradition anyway. And so, yes, it would be great to see better provision of healthcare worldwide. Of course it would. But by simply saying this is an education problem, this stuff doesn't work, we miss a delivery mechanism that frankly isn't going to get solved anytime soon.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. I've got quite a few questions coming in, which is excellent from the audience. So I'm not going to move on to some of those, and some of those overlap with the other questions I picked up on. And the first one, actually, it's always the case, whenever I talk about, or anyone talks about pandas, you will get someone coming in for the panda. And this is Nicola Kuhn. And she said, what about the role of pandas or other less keystone type species that are considered charismatic in rallying conservation support value for nature? And I think this also builds on this question of, is it the fluffy pandas, or is it something like Extinction Rebellion that are really going to bring about a change? So who would like to respond to this one? Tim.
So you know, I understand that using things like fluffy pandas or you know, red pandas or charismatic species along those lines, you know, they are engaging and they can make people sort of sit up and think, and they say, I don't want to see the panda go extinct. However, that's not enough, because we sort of need to move the debate along, and I think we have done from single species, because if it's a single species, I think most people would say it will be a shame if it goes extinct, but it probably doesn't really matter. But the argument is, if we start changing ecosystems and we change the services they provide, and we knock our Earth systems into a very different state from where they are now by doing all of that, then I think we're in trouble. And I don't think focusing on the panda is going to help very much, personally. You know, I'm not anti-panda, I should say that. I'm not, and I think it has served a great role, actually, of getting people to think about conservation and think about the natural world. I think it's done that role, but I think we've sort of moved on beyond that need for iconic species. And, you know, I actually would be really sad if the panda went extinct. I have to say that, to be honest. But
All right.
I would be more worried if other species went extinct. I would be much more worried if honeybees went extinct. Okay,
thank you. We've got a lot of questions. So does anyone else want to add to that or disagree with that? Rich?
One other thing. I think it's true that single species focus for charismatic megafauna has been problematic, but we've come up, actually my own research group and in particular some collaborators in Australia earlier this year came out with a really neat, I think it's a really neat paper, in which we can actually work out which species have the right balance between where they are, what state they're in, and how much people care within a computational framework. So we can set up a network of panda-like species, which can act as funding mechanisms, can act as advertisers, but also are specifically chosen that they're the right set of species, so that if you were to be able to look after them, you'd end up with a decent umbrella effect for others. So you're right, absolutely right. Single species charisma is not the way to go, but in being aware of the fact that different species have different appeals to different audiences is fundamental to actually getting anything in the way of biodiversity messaging done. So we can square that circle a bit.
Okay, I'm good. Erin, would you like to come in quickly? There is another question that's linked through to this. So if you'd like to have a quick comment on this.
Just a quick comment on what Rich and Tim said. I absolutely agree in that I think you need buy-in from the public and from especially local communities. And so often that is through education, or that's through charismatic species, that they can understand the value of them in their particular ecosystems, or just because they're charismatic and fluffy and people love them. But I think really we need to transition to this ecosystem level approach and teaching people the value of this ecosystem as a whole entity. And I think that's a tricky thing, and that's what we really need to focus on right now. And I know one of the questions that came in is about that.
Yeah.
How do you educate the public? And I think it's a really good question that we should consider.
So that is the question I was picking up on, because I think this one's from Maria Dance, who says, I feel that in public discourse the emphasis on extinction is on individual species, but the link between species extinctions and loss of ecological function, ecosystem integrity, is not widely recognised in the general public, despite the IPBES reports, that one I pointed out at the beginning, particularly in societies removed from a connection with nature. And her question, though, is what can be done about this? Because even if we all agree, how do we turn this around? Tanisha, do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think I think doing like, I guess from my perspective in terms of doing outreach, like, we can use these charismatic species as a way, kind of like as a Trojan horse to get other people to care about these issues. So for example, with pandas, like you can say like, yes, pandas are cute, or if you want to talk about lions, I guess, lions are cool, but but this is the environment that they're living in. These are the other plants or animals that these charismatic species need to survive. And so we also need to care about these things as well. And then obviously like with climate change, we can talk about, well, with extreme changes in climate, these charismatic species won't have these other, plants or animals that they need to survive. So I think, so I think, in my opinion, just doing a lot more, I guess education and outreach in terms of just expanding it beyond just a single species or like a single factor thing.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on this one? Yes, Tim.
So how do you make that link? I think perhaps one of the ways you make that link is you focus on a species that plays a really important ecosystem service for humanity. And pollinators would be an example there. I mentioned honeybees earlier, and you asked the question, and we actually know quite a lot now in terms of what the answers to those questions are, is what if we lose this species that many people might think is annoying, it hurts when it stings you, it flies around, it buzzes, it gets stuck on the window inside, if you're thinking about some pollinating insects. And then you think, well, if we lost those pollinating insects, here are all of the insect pollinated crops, often perennial crops that we rely on. And so I think the way that you make the link is that you actually explain in the types of outreach that Tanisha's been talking about of what those links are and what the consequences are. So you go from individual species that are perhaps not the charismatic ones and say, if these went, this is what the consequence for humanity is going to be. And this is why many biologists, many ecosystem scientists are trying to move the debate on from a single charismatic species that may not have a significant ecosystem impact if they went extinct, onto why we are trying to take a more ecosystem focus.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to this one?
I did want to ask Erin a question, if I may. Sorry to butt in, but
okay, fine.
I wondered, are there any species that from the fossil record that you really wish hadn't gone extinct, that you would like to be around now, given our sort of focus on some of these charismatic animals that we're worrying about that are still extinct?
That's a great question. There's actually a lot of species I wish hadn't gone extinct, and one of them are called Heteromorph Ammonites. And ammonites are these shelled creatures that look a bit like nautilus that are alive today, that lived in the sea. But Heteromorph Ammonites are the ones that had these wonky shells that curved in every which way, and some of them could get really large, and it would be very cool if they were around still.
What did they do? If you're coming back to this, persuading people that this is an important thing to have lost, what did these things do?
It's a good question. They were likely keystone predators in the marine realm. So they were nectonic, so swimming around in the water column, fishing out things like other squids and fish, things like that. So yeah, so they were likely quite important in terms of being top-down predators on the ecosystem.
Brilliant. Okay, another question that's come in is actually about one of the drivers of biodiversity loss, which is the alien invasive species. So we often hear about land use change, and we hear about pollution and overexploitation, but one of the other in that box I showed at the beginning, alien invasive species outcompeting other species. And so this question from Sebuan said, do any of the panelists have an opinion on invasive alien species? As one of the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, they're seen as something that has to be managed. However, alien invasive species might have to move to new habitats because of climate change, habitat loss, and they might push out native species that have gone extinct anyway. also because of their pressures. So the question is, with an invasive, is it a constructed concept? Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide whether or not something should be removed or left in place? And I would like to come back to your bees, Tim, because some of the alien invasive species are pollinators. So do you allow them to carry on, or do you take them out of the system because they are driving extinction of native biodiversity?
It's a really good question, and it's a difficult one to give a blanket answer to, because many species that are introduced into an area don't establish, or if they do establish, they don't have particularly significant effects on the ecosystem. But every now and again, an invasive species comes out, and it can have a significant effect on ecosystems, and it can change the function of ecosystems because it's competing with another species that has a service that the invasive doesn't provide. And it can have knock-on effects. And actually, being able to identify in advance which species, invasive species, are going to have a major impact on the ecosystems in which they invade is a really hard thing to do. And I think that probably the most sensible strategy is to try, if possible, to limit the number of invasive species that are coming from certainly the other side of the world into these new environments that you're introducing into environments where they haven't co-evolved with things. And I would prefer to try and, when we're thinking about species moving in response to environmental change, I would try and take something from reasonably nearby that would have a chance of actually dispersing into that area itself. However, I have to say, Rich is much better placed to talk about sort of macroevolutionary dynamics along those lines in terms of space than I am. So it's possible I've just been waffling there, but I'll perhaps.
Okay, Rich, has Tim been waffling?
Oh no, not by anyone else's standards other than his. So yeah, I'm a bit more sanguine about this, to be totally honest. Or if not, I think we actually need to look at the relative scales of those drivers of species extinctions in context. And it's really hard when you see a UK riverbank covered in Himalayan balsam or a waste ground covered in Japanese knotweed to say that invasive species are not as big a driver of extinction as either of the other two that we've covered. And not as big a problem as climate change. But that's absolutely true. We need to keep a laser focus on land use change for the next 30 years and climate change for the next 50 after that. If we've got capacity on top of that, then invasive species would be something to look at. But as Tim rightly points out, something like only 1 or 0.1% of species in outside their native range, whatever that means, actually go on to become an ecological problem. That's not true of mangrove removal, for example. 100% of that is a problem when it occurs. So yeah, so I'm a bit more sanguine about invasive species than some.
Okay, all right, thank you. Do either of the other two want to comment on this, or we'll move on? Erin.
Yeah, just briefly, I think taking a longer term perspective on this, and again, it matters in terms of your time scale, you see that species have shifted their distributions incredibly over Earth history, and you have entire shifts in groups or clades from, say, the Northern Hemisphere to the Southern Hemisphere. And so I think that these sort of invasions and movements of species happen on really large scales of space, but also through time. And so they can be a natural process. And so I would just echo Rich's comment that I think sort of the rate of climate change and rate of habitat loss is probably more concerning right now.
Okay, there's let's move on to another question. It's an interesting one about the relationship between nature and psychological health, human health. It's from Paul Rapley. If psychological health be a requirement for human survival, and if many cultures use animals as moral examples, and he's given chicken licking and foxy loxy, can we survive their loss? Who'd like, Tanisha, would you like to start on this one? Or Rich, if you go first, and then we'll come to Tanisha.
I was excited about this one because this has been for a while. I absolutely agree that and particularly at the moment when we're seeing what the consequences of an acute global problem are on our psychology as individuals and as groups, It's absolutely true that we need to recognise the psychological consequences of biodiversity loss and the psychological consequences of climate change as well, of course. How does that relate to biodiversity? Well, one of the interesting things that I think we've seen repeatedly over the last 50 years is that species which, and this is, I'm afraid, Tim, another reason why I disagree with some species as unvaluable. We've seen repeatedly that the diversity of species that are out there play out time and time again in the diversity of cultural responses that we get to them. I've seen fabulous papers, admittedly somewhat silly, about Disney films and the diversity of species that have been portrayed in Disney films has increased from an evolutionary and psychological perspective over the last 50 years. And yet we don't seem to have found any sign of stopping. We've had films like the Ice Age trilogy, where extinct, small, fairly boring mammals with slightly pointy teeth have become cultural icons for a bit. Clownfish. I think there's actually basically a one-to-one correspondence between the number of species that there are and the number of ways in which humanity, in some location or place or culture or whatever, has found a way to value them. So I'm absolutely with the underlying ethos of this question. I think we need species to get us through whatever is coming, in as much as species need us to get themselves through.
That's an interesting way to think. Tanisha, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Rich in that, yes, like biodiversity is has a huge impact, or can have a huge impact on psychological health. And I think on top of that, we also need to make sure that people in general have more access to biodiverse green spaces, because based on some research I've read recently, the groups that tend to have the least access to green spaces tend to be BAME, or people of color, and also those obviously in urban areas. So in terms of, so I think in terms of, we also need more biodiversity, but we also need to make sure that more people have access to this biodiversity in their own backyard, or, or local parks or school grounds or whatever, so that way they can actually, have this, they can actually, have this hands-on effect, or this more, up close and personal effect.
Yeah. Interesting. So the argument, you would agree that actually we need biodiversity for our mental well-being as much as biodiversity needs us to protect it from going extinct. Tim, what's your thoughts on this?
So I think green spaces, going out, seeing biodiversity is important. Although looking out the window at the moment, I'm quite glad I'm inside. But yeah, I really value, one of the things that I found hard about lockdown is I have a really lovely walk into work, and I've sort of missed doing that regularly. It was a great way to wind down at the end of the day or get ready to go in. And so I certainly see a correlation between my own personal mental functioning and well-being and being out in open spaces. However, I think there's, I'm really glad that Disney haven't made a film about a cuddly Anopheles gambii, which is the mosquito that spreads malaria, because I think that the attempts that we're seeing at the moment to drive numbers of Anopheles gambii down to actually improve human welfare in parts of the world where malaria is endemic is a really positive thing. So I think we also need to factor in human well-being into this discussion, including not just mental health, but also other forms of disease. So I'm not sure it's quite as clear-cut as perhaps some of the other panelists have argued.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. Yes, I was going to say with plants, normally they're depicted as they're the triffids. So there's we don't have nice plant Disney cartoons. Anyway, let's move on. And this one, Erin, I'd like your views on this first of all, which is from Joshua Jones, saying many of the early reports used and actually that is true of all of the reports I mentioned at the beginning, used the 1970s as a baseline. Given humans have had a significant impact since the late Pleistocene, e.g. the extinctions in Madagascar, Australia, New Zealand megafauna, Pacific birds and British mammals, does this approach of using this 1970s baseline run the risk of obscuring more negative fundamental aspects of humanity's relationship with the natural world? I think it's a very good question. And Erin, from your sort of paleobotanical or paleobiological background, could you start your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it is a good question. And essentially this question is asking about shifting baselines, where essentially we're always sort of moving the level at which we are comparing biodiversity loss to. So we don't actually realize how bad it is because we already have a degraded sort of baseline in which we're comparing. And there are competing sort of ideas as to whether this is okay or not. Some people think that that's okay as long as we have some baseline that is allows us to maintain sort of human well-being and biodiversity at levels that we are okay with as humans. Others think that actually we should be shifting our baselines backwards before more significant human effects on the environment, and that will allow us to shoot for a better target, which will sort of allow us to conserve more biodiversity. I think in terms of humans' relationship with the natural world, I mean, absolutely, ever since humans evolved, we've been having a large effect on the environment. And in ice core records, we can see deforestation by indigenous people in America, and we can see smelting and the production of iron ores from the Western world in Roman times. So I mean, we actually have records of humans' effect going back, centuries on biodiversity. And of course, there's a debate about whether people killed megafauna, so led to the demise of charismatic species already, like mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed cats. And it's a debate, right? And because on one side there's climate change, on the other side there's human hunting pressures. And essentially, my answer is that, I think it's really interesting and useful to look at baselines and to look at the effects of humans on the environment over time, to characterize those baselines. But whether we use them as actual conservation targets is a different question. But I think we as humans need to recognize how we have dramatically affected the biosphere over thousands of years.
Okay, all right, thank you. Who else wants to add that? Rich, do you want to come in on this? You were nodding then.
No, just nodding in agreement. It's the general rule of life that nothing good came out of the 1970s, and I think that's probably what to stick with.
So where would you place, if you had to place I mean, there needs to be, if you need to measure a trend, where would you place the beginning of that measurement then?
Well, so underneath that question, actually, to take a step back, is do we actually want to take a past analog view of what we're trying to achieve? And I think that actually obscures quite a few options that we might, with a little bit of mental rearrangement, find more amenable to going forward. It ties in very closely with that idea of invasive species as to whether or not they're too much of a threat. But for the 1% that causes problems, actually 99% of those invasions result in actually slight cosmetic differences to ecosystems and a reasonable sort of refugium from the world. Strangely, one of the very few, I think now endangered mammals I've ever actually eaten is a Chinese water deer, which you can get pretty easily on the open market in East Anglia at the moment, where they are a pest after a reintroduction that has led to a bit of an over population boom in the Norfolk Broads. Now, that's a really interesting point. Are they causing trouble? Yes, they are. They actually need to be managed. But is anybody objecting really to them being there if they can be managed? No, not really. Is the population in better health in the Norfolk Broads than it is in much of the former native range in China? Yeah, it is, actually. So we've got a healthy invasive population that's actually being looked after. And that means we actually could maybe see this as a model for a lot more species in the future, if we were to get rid of the idea that we need to hit some kind of past reconstruction.
Okay, Tim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry. So I just wanted to come in there. I think Rich is right. The spatial scale is important, about the spatial scale being important. And, that's a nice example from one animal. But you you do need, I think, some sort of baseline in order to know where you're at and how things are changing. And I don't think we can do that on a very, very fine spatial scale globally. So I think we need to do that. I think we probably do need some trends on a broader spatial scale.
I absolutely agree with that, actually, Tim.
And you need to have where you choose to put your baseline, you have to have comparable data. So there's no point in us putting the baseline in 1643, right? Because we didn't have good surveys of what was there and what wasn't there. The 1970s is probably about right, in my opinion. You know, people had, there were many surveys. There were surveys going on. We were sort of seeing the first satellites up there collecting data on global distribution of forests and what have you. You know, it is a bit arbitrary, but that arbitrariness needs to come from the quality of data that you're collecting. So you're comparing as much as possible of apples with apples rather than apples with oranges.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. We've got some questions now more about sort of well, there's one about trade here, where companies are trading on flora and fauna or ecosystems as trademarks or brand names, for example, Lynx, Jaguar, Amazon. How might they be persuaded to keep alive the species underlying the brand or product? Do you think that's a good idea? Who would like to comment on that?
I actually really do think that there's something to be done here. There's a fantastic database run out of, I think, the University of Washington in the US, which tries to keep, something I was going to do and then I found someone else had already done it, which is always nice, which tries to keep an eye on bio-inspiration and the commercial value of things derived from nature, whether this is natural products in chemistry for drug use or mechanical devices or software algorithms that are based on behavior and so on. But actually, one thing it doesn't cover is sort of inspirational or cultural value. And I think it's actually fairly easy to make the case that if you've got a plant and it gives rise to a natural product which can give you an anti-cancer drug that's worth £13 billion a year and saves X lives, you've got a very nice reason for not just looking after that plant, but plants like it or regions like it and so on. But actually, as you say, Amazon, I don't think people actually connect Amazon, the firm, with Amazon, the place. But if they did, you actually get a significant transfer of value. And I don't see any reason why that can't be monetized and legislated in the same way. So I do think it's a neat idea.
Okay, anybody else want to add to that?
No, I just agree. I think it's a really neat idea. And I think there is the possibility of getting these companies to buy into this as well. So yeah, absolutely.
But it does raise, that response of yours, Richard, and also the question itself does raise a more fundamental question, which is one many people are battling with right now, is do we actually have to put a price on biodiversity before people start to truly value it? So who'd like to comment on that? Richard, do you want to come back in on this, or Erin?
I can well imagine that there's silence there, because this is a thing that nobody really wants to get to grips with. It goes instantaneously from how do we value, is it possible to value meaningfully, straightforward, to do we value, what else do we value, comparative valuation, comparative politics, and then we get stuck. So for me, I think the question is always better rephrased as what happens if you do this? What are the consequences of, does this work? And we haven't got a database yet. We don't have enough of a time period over which we've attempted market valuation mechanisms, payment for ecosystem services. It's clear that you can find examples where they've worked, and it's also clear you can find examples where they've had significant negative perverse incentives. So I'm just to like get this out there, I'm very much on the fence about these, but I'm not saying which way I'm going to fall at the moment. I think it would be helpful to see this from an evidence-based and empirical perspective. The question is time to do that.
Of course, the one marketplace there is right now is the carbon offsetting market, where a price is being put on biodiversity. But as you say, there are perverse things coming through from that. Erin, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just echo what Rich said. I think it's a difficult it's difficult and it's a complicated situation, and how you value biodiversity and how you compare that value to other things that humans value is very complicated. I think you can I think you can have value in these brands and talk to companies that have names after biodiversity and do it in a way that doesn't necessarily require direct valuation, but it's tricky, and so and there are negative consequences, for example, with regard to the carbon. So yeah, I like Richard don't know exactly where I fall on this issue.
Tim, and then Tanisha.
So you'll be amazed to hear, have all the answers. But I don't think we should be valuing biodiversity, because I don't want to make a market out of biodiversity, and I don't want to do that because it's too important. And it's I don't think it's very likely to work by putting a value on it and trying to trade it, or trying to sell it, or trying to trade it off against something else. Or by saying, well, if you've done this much damage over here, you've got to go and make it up by doing something over here. I think that approach, by turning to that sort of capitalist approach to try and get our way out of a mess that essentially the markets have got us into, is not the solution.
How do you bring the markets on board then, Tim? If you just want to turn that one round, to find the positive way of working with markets and the big organizations, how do you turn it around to get them to take extinction seriously?
Again, I don't think that's the right solution. I think the right solution is through protection and through policy and through taxation, and not linking that taxation directly to use of biodiversity, personally.
Okay, all right, thank you. Tanisha, you wanted to comment on this one.
Yeah, so I think it would be an interesting area of research to see which demographics tend to, I guess, respond better to applying some type of value to biodiversity, even though, again, like others have said, I don't really think it's something that should be done. But in terms of applying a value, we can also look beyond applying a monetary value to more sentimental value. So a lot of people mention being interested in conservation because, they want their children or their grandchildren to see an elephant or a rhino. Prince William says that all the time. I want my children or grandchildren to see wildlife. So maybe if we can look beyond monetary value, that would help, and maybe find some type of other value, like emotional or sentimental value, then maybe that might be just as useful.
Okay, Tim, come back in.
I'd like to know what you think about this, Kathy, because I think you might disagree with me.
I'm chairing the debate.
I mean, I agree with Tim and Tanisha that it gets to be a tricky thing to do, and there are consequences of engaging the markets and valuing biodiversity. But I would also argue for the opposite side of the coin, which is why I'm so conflicted on this issue, in that money sells, right? We are in a capitalist society, and making people realize the value of biodiversity by placing real monetary, so in terms of a plant contributing to cancer drugs, or in terms of whatever it is, the resources that are used in particular regions contributing to the economy. I think that makes policymakers and governmental officials aware of the capital and of the importance of biodiversity, and it's often difficult to have that engagement and that recognition or realization without, unfortunately, putting a monetary value on it. So I'm not arguing to be in favor, but I think that there is, unfortunately, given how our society works, there is a value to that.
I mean, Tim, I will just answer one thing. If it means it stops corporations from thinking that biodiversity is something is freely available to be plundered, then I'm all for it, because I can't see any other way. A fluffy panda won't work with a big corporation.
Yeah, I agree.
You have to have different languages for different drivers, I think, and particularly with land use change, you have to say this is how much this land is worth because of the societal benefit nature provides on it. Therefore, if you're going to take that away, you have to pay for that. But that would be but there's a question here from Nicola Kuhn along these lines, and then we'll come back to some other ones. Along the same lines, large corporations are putting increasingly more aside to invest specifically in biodiversity. So if the biodiversity conservation community don't want to engage with this, aren't we losing a valuable resource?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back on that. I think that's right, that we do risk losing a valuable resource, but I think we also need to we need to sort of make sure that that money isn't guilt money, and it's, you know, actually sufficient to cover any you know, any negative impacts that that company has done. And I mean, it's really interesting, actually. One of the things that you know, I've come across in other parts of my world is in my work, we're seeing a growing number of philanthropists putting money into environment, and you know, that's great. That's absolutely fantastic, and ditto for large organizations. But it's also certainly clear that some of that is some of it's driven by an appreciation. This is probably a positive thing, an appreciation that the way they've made their money has been through exploitation of natural resources. And I think when that realization has happened, and people have thought, actually, I've done really well, but there have been costs to what I've done, I'm going to put something back in. That has to be a positive thing, but I just hope the amount that's going back in is sufficient to cover the damage that's done. And I'm often unclear whether that's actually the right balance.
So I've got another question here, just because we've got quite a few questions to get through and I'm mindful of the time. And this comes from Serene Irwin. In combating extinction, what should conservationists be putting their greatest efforts into? Preventing habitat degradation, which is recognised as the highest cause of extinction loss today, or climate change? Which of course might not be happening now, but almost certainly we will see an extinction debt in years to come from the impacts that are happening now. So where do we put our energies, our money, and also our lobbying force? You think about the Extinction Rebellion, a lot of that is coming around in terms of climate change, not right now, extinction of plants and animals. Thoughts on this? Rich, do you want to have a comment on, Tim or?
I can do, but I think, so Saren is one of my tutees, so she's probably heard what I would have to say already, but I will come in, but I'll leave it to other people first to mention.
Okay, so Tanisha, would you like to comment on this one?
It's a really good question, because I think the two are so interlinked that it's hard to really prioritize either one. So for example, with climate change, like, you know, with all these increasing number of hurricanes and especially the wildfires that have been, you know, ravaging like Australia and the Western United States, like obviously that is leading to habitat degradation. And then, you know, but I don't know, it's so hard just because they're so interlinked. Yeah, and so I'm not sure there's a way to kind of evenly split it like 50-50, like, you know, put some resources towards habitat degradation and then also put some resources towards climate change, or, you know, somehow put resources in some type of meeting point between the two, seeing like where the two intertwine.
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone else want to ask that one, or we'll move on to another question? Tim.
Sorry, I keep coming in. I completely agree with Tanisha. These things are linked, and prioritizing one and ignoring the other is not the solution. And in fact, trees are pretty good at taking carbon dioxide out and locking it into wood and what have you. Of course, they eventually reach a stable state, but if you plant, you know, biodiversity has a role to help us mitigate the consequences of climate change. It's not going to solve it on its own. We also need to reduce CO2 emissions. We also need some technology to help here. But also vice versa, the other way around, is that, if we keep pushing up CO2, we're also going to be continuing to impact the negative feedback onto biodiversity. So we need, an impact on a poor impact on biodiversity. Climate, CO2 levels and biodiversity are linked. They have dynamics that operate on a wide range of temporal scales, and we need to use one to address the other, but we also need to realize that they're linked, and just by saying let's solve the carbon problem does not mean that we can take our eye off the ball on biodiversity, or vice versa. They both need to be done. They both need to be addressed together. Okay,
thank you. Erin?
Yeah, I think I would just like to echo what Tim said, is that I think they're intimately linked. And just to give a stat for something that Tim said, is that, for example, tropical old growth forests from the late 1990s to early 2000s are estimated to have taken up 15% of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And that's a pretty incredible stat. Yes, we absolutely probably need, or definitely need, additional mitigating factors. We need to reduce our CO2 emissions. We need, other technologies to address this problem. But that's a pretty incredible stat. So I think these things go hand in hand.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Another question that's come through from Pam Greet, just going back to our other discussion about valuation of biodiversity, is the other side of the coin. It's the polluter pays approach. And she said, why should it be an attempt to work with markets, agree taxation for damage to the environment, tight rules needed internationally, e.g. toxic pesticides? So do you think it should be polluter pays, or should we be trying to value biodiversity? Which do you think would be more effective? Who'd like to comment on this? Rich?
I'm not sure that they're totally separate. After all, polluter pays is as a principle asks the next question, which is polluter pays how much? So I don't think you can quite talk about damages, which is really what we're talking about. It'd be very interesting to hear a lawyer's perspective on this. Like actually the valuation there is presumably very complex under conventional legal frameworks of tort and consequence.
Anybody else want to comment on this? No? Then there's one other question that which comes right back to where we started at the beginning when we were talking about Indigenous practices. And the question is, should Indigenous practices be assessed by Western scientific methods before we incorporate them into conservation practices? Tanisha, you spoke about the Indigenous practices. Do you want to comment on this one?
To say that Indigenous practices should be assessed by Western standards, I mean, personally, that makes me feel a bit uncomfortable just from a very neo-colonialist standpoint, and that, because like obviously these Indigenous practices have worked, before these lands were colonized. And so for the colonizers to say, well, we need to use our own standards to see what you're doing actually works. I think the best approach would be to, whenever we do work in conservation, to work with the local Indigenous people to see what they've been doing and work alongside them. But I'm not sure if that would involve necessarily assessing their practices by Western standards. To me, that just feels very kind of neo-colonialist, but I'm sure other people have other perspectives.
Anybody else want to comment on that one?
I mean, the problem underlying all of this is that the motivation for wanting to assess is driven by the sense of crisis that it's only got measurement and measurement of consequence and measurement of impact, that it's possible to assess whether or not a particular action is functional or not. The pressure to have a solution to that question, which is, let's face it, not an easy one, is the real shame here, because there should be an interesting academic and therefore actually rather limited debate about competing or alternative ontologies of what works and what doesn't, or what species are or what aren't, or what management is or what isn't. This should be interesting, and unfortunately we've now got the external environment has forced us into a combat, and I don't have a good solution to that, frankly. I think it's really deeply problematic.
Okay, well, we're running out of time. So for the last 5 minutes, what I'd really like to do to wrap up, we've gone through most of the questions. I apologise if anyone's question hasn't been addressed, but I think otherwise we will run out of time. Just for the last 5 minutes, I would just like to ask the panel to say, if you could do one thing to reduce the extinction risk, what would that be? And it could be something personal or it could be something global. Who wants to start? Erin, how about you?
That's tricky. One thing. I need a moment to think about this.
All right, anybody else want to come in here? Tim.
Okay, if there was one thing, one wish, and you'll kind of expect this from an academic, education. I would love to see, and I think we're doing this in curricula, certainly within the UK and hopefully globally. I don't know about curricula elsewhere. I'm really pleased, I'm really excited that, issues about biodiversity and the environment and global change are being taught in schools to a much greater extent than when I was back in school in the late Jurassic. And I think that's a really positive thing. And the one thing that I would wish for at that level is, in terms of extinction, is that continues and we continue that education. I hope that by taking part in these sorts of debates and giving public lectures, we're able to actually draw people who didn't have the opportunity to study this at school or to be taught this at school to engage. And then finally, the other thing is, and I think this is really important at the moment, we've had a discussion here and some of the audience may think, oh, there's been quite a lot of disagreement between the scientists and we don't agree on everything, but I think in general, we accept this as a crisis. We accept that something needs to be done. The areas of disagreement that we have are about exactly what order you do things and what the priority is. But I think there's actually a huge amount of scientific consensus here. And I think that's really important to put across, because I think quite often people go away and hear a dissenting voice saying something else. They think, oh, the scientists are split, they don't know what they're doing. But I think there's a huge amount of consensus here. So the other thing is, I would like people, I wish that people had generally had a better understanding of when scientific consensus generally existed versus when it didn't.
Okay, all right, thank you. That's two things. Tanisha. Yeah, Tanisha, go on.
Oh, Eric can go first.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I guess kind of following on from Tim, and I guess also my personal experience with doing outreach is just like not only doing outreach, but also doing outreach towards to get more underrepresented and marginalized groups involved in conservation and biology and ecology. Because again, like we've mentioned before, we need all hands on deck. And so even though this is a global issue, it seems like the voices that are leading these conversations about extinction and conservation tend to be white Westerners. And so in order to get a better perspective on what we need to do and what all the details of the problem are, we need to get more, especially more people of color involved, and make sure that they have an equal voice in these conversations and that it's not this kind of white savior complex. So yeah, just getting more marginalized and underrepresented people involved, which also goes into, again, a whole other topic about, the pipeline of, yes, these people of color, marginalized or underrepresented groups want to go into conservation or biology, but then there's all these obstacles in the way that prevent them from, making a contribution or reaching the higher levels of conservation, which that's a whole other topic.
Okay, all right, thank you. Rich, or actually no, Erin, sorry, I know you were ready to come in. Erin, off you go, and then we'll finish.
Yeah, so to choose something different other than education. So I have education is a great answer. Because if people are educated about these problems, they will presumably start to make different choices, and then that will cascade up to governmental decisions and policy decisions about saving biodiversity. But in terms of if I'm forced to choose something else, I would say reducing people's carbon footprints. So I think on an everyday, like concrete basis, what that people can actually do right now in their homes is reducing their carbon footprint, and there's lots of resources out there to do that, and not traveling and having Zoom meetings is one way.
Okay, all right, we still enforce Zoom. Rich.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to this would also have been my answer to Saren's question about how to integrate biodiversity loss and climate change related action. For me, the answer to that is that you find issues and activities and human behaviors that are maximally important to both of those negative consequences and try and work with those. So you find a lever that you can pull that has that's attached to two things. And there's a couple of those that really stand out. In a slightly more minor way, peat extraction. Both peat extraction in the temperate zones, particularly peat extraction and burning in the tropics, is a colossal source of carbon emission. It's also catastrophic for biodiversity. That can be wildfires as well, by the way. But then more than anything else, and this isn't just blatant self-promotion, although it might come across as this, it's the food system. It's looking at how we produce, distribute waste, and what we choose to eat, because both of those two things, that single part of the human existence affects 25% of carbon emissions and something like 60% of the world's surface. It's the single big lever that we have to work out what to pull and how to pull it and where it needs to be set.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we have come to the end of this debate. I just want to say a huge thank you to the four panelists for doing such a superb job and dealing with some fantastic questions from the audience. I hope everybody has come away feeling their questions have been answered, but also make them think more about the extinction crisis and what we can all individually do to address this. So I'm now going to wrap up and say goodbye and thank you very much, everybody, for such an interesting hour. Thank you.